The Kansas Prairie in Rice County in January of 1873 was in the middle of what the settlers of the Smoky Hill River country would later describe as the hardest winter they had seen since the first wave of homesteading had come to the region in the late 1860s. The winter had begun with a November cold event that had set the tone for what followed, and by January the pattern was established. Blue northers, arriving every 10 to 12 days from the Colorado and Nebraska country to the northwest, each one bringing a period of temperatures between -10 and -22 with northwest winds that had nothing between them and the Rice County claims except 100 miles of flat Kansas prairie. The snowfall accumulation was above average, and each new blue norther added to the consolidated base that the previous events had deposited, so that by the second week of January the open ground snow depth was approximately 2.5 feet in the undrifted sections, and 6 to 8 feet in the coulee depressions and the south and east faces of the farm structures. Hannah Morse had been managing the claim on the Big Creek tributary of the Smoky Hill River since the death of Jonas in September of 1872 from the cholera that the dry summer had concentrated in the shallow creek water. Jonas had filed the claim in 1869 and had spent 3 seasons building the sod house, the small frame barn, and the woodpile management system that was the critical infrastructure for a Kansas winter. The cottonwood and Osage orange from the Big Creek bottomland, cut and split in the summer and stacked in the open-sided shed that Jonas had built against the barn's south face. The wood supply going into the winter of 1872 to 73 was adequate, approximately 4.5 cords, but it was in the open-sided shed, and the open-sided sheds to walls and roof were not sufficient protection for the specific Kansas blizzard problem. The specific problem was the Kansas Blue Norther's combination of driving snow and extreme temperature. A Blue Norther in Rice County in January did not simply snow. It drove the snow horizontally at 35 to 40 miles per hour and packed it into every opening, every gap, every face of any structure that was not sealed against the wind direction. The open-sided shed was open on its south face, which was the lie face in normal conditions. But the Blue Northers came from the northwest and drove snow in a direction that the shed's south opening could not protect against. After each norther event, the woodpile in the south-facing open shed had 4 to 6 inches of wind-packed snow on every horizontal surface, and on the south faces of the individual wood pieces, and the subsequent freeze-thaw cycling bonded the snow to the wood and bonded adjacent pieces to each other. Hannah had watched this happen through the winter of 1871 to 72. The last winter that Jonas had managed the woodpile, and had seen how much labor went into breaking the iced woodpile apart after each norther event. Jonas had used a wooden mallet and a pry bar to separate the bonded pieces, spending 30 minutes at the pile before each wood retrieval. After the worst norther events, the lower 2 courses of the pile were so thoroughly bonded with ice that even the mallet and pry bar could not separate individual pieces, and Jonas had resorted to bringing the entire bonded section inside the sod house and allowing it to thaw for several hours before splitting the ice-cemented courses by hand. With Jonas gone and only 16-year-old Ezra as the available labor, the iced woodpile was a problem that Hannah could not solve by brute force. She needed to prevent the ice bonding from occurring, which meant she needed to prevent the wind-driven snow from reaching the woodpile during the norther events. She needed a cover that would protect the woodpile not only from snow falling vertically, the open-sided shed did this adequately, but from snow driven horizontally at 35 miles per hour from the northwest. She had been thinking about the cover problem since November, when the first Blue Norther had shown her that the open-sided shed was inadequate. She had 3 constraints. She had no additional lumber for a permanent enclosed shed. She had the cottonwood and willow of the Big Creek bottomland, which Ezra could cut and bring to the claim. And she had approximately 2 days before the January 9th norther was expected. The barometric pressure had been falling for 2 days on January 7th, and the cloud quality on the northwest horizon had the specific flat-bottomed appearance that the Rice County settlers had learned to associate with an incoming severe event. The bent pole arch was the solution she arrived at on January 7th afternoon, when she combined the 2 things she had available, the Big Creek willow and the time before the storm, into a construction that the arch form made structurally capable of what the flat roof could not do. The arch form, a flat roof over a woodpile, however well built, accumulated snow. In a severe Kansas Blue Norther, 4 to 6 inches of wind-packed snow on a flat roof became first a load, then a collapse risk. Then, when the temperature dropped to -15 after the norther passed, a frozen slab that was essentially part of the roof and that would not shed until the spring thaw. A flat roof was a snow accumulation surface. An arch, by contrast, shed snow. The curved surface allowed the snow that fell or was driven against it to slide down the curve rather than accumulating as a flat load. The steeper the arch curve, the faster the snow shed. An arch built at a steep enough curve angle would remain essentially clear of snow accumulation throughout a norther event. She sent Ezra to Big Creek on the morning of January 8th for green willow poles, the second-year willow growth that the creek bottom produced in abundance, approximately 1 inch in diameter and 6 to 8 feet long, flexible enough to bend into an arch when cut green and still carrying the year's sap. He cut 40 poles and brought them back in 2 bundles on the horse. She had already cleared a 4-foot-wide path around the woodpile and had driven the first set of paired stakes into the frozen ground at the piles. East and west ends, 6 pairs of stakes, spaced 3 feet apart from south to north, each pair planted 8 feet apart across the pile's width. The stakes were cottonwood posts, approximately 2 feet long and 3 inches in diameter, driven into the ground with the fence mole to approximately 14 inches of depth in the frozen January soil. Ezra and Hannah bent the green willow poles over the woodpile as a series of arches. Each pole, approximately 6 to 7 feet long, was forced into a curve from one stake of a pair to the other, its ends lashed to the stakes with the braided grass cord that Jonas had used for the claim's fencing before the wire supply arrived in 1871. The willow's green flexibility, the sap wood that had not yet dried, allowed it to hold the arch curve under the tension of the lashing without cracking. 6 arches across the piles with 1 at each stake pair, spaced 3 feet apart from south to north, along the pile's 12-foot length. Above the arch set, Ezra wove for longitudinal willow rods through the arch tops, creating the lateral structure that kept the arches from swaying under wind pressure. The covering cottonwood bark slabs, cut from the straight cottonwood sections that Jonas had split in the summer, and that produced the characteristic large flat bark pieces of the mature cottonwood. She had Ezra retrieve the bark pile from the barn. Jonas had kept bark for kindling, and she lapped the bark slabs over the arch structure like shingles, each slab overlapping the one below by 4 inches, from the bottom course upward. The bark's natural curvature matched the arch's curve and lay flat against it. Between the bark courses, she wove dried willow branches from the previous years, cutting the dead willow from the Big Creek clearing pile that Ezra had also brought in the bundle to fill the gaps. The construction took January 8th, from the pole cutting to the final bark course, approximately 8 hours of work for 2 people. It was complete by the evening of January 8th. The norther arrived on the morning of January 9th. The January 9th through 14th norther, 5.5 days. Temperature -14 to -18, northwest wind at 38 miles per hour. The arch shed the driven snow exactly as she had calculated it would. The curved surface allowed the wind-packed snow to slide along the curvature and fall off the arch's lower edge, rather than accumulating as a horizontal load. The bark and willow covering did not accumulate more than 1 inch of snow on any section of the arch throughout the 5.5-day event. The wind kept the curved surfaces essentially clear, while the flat surfaces of the open shed walls, the barn roof, and the sod house accumulated 4 to 6 inches of wind-packed snow. The woodpile below the arch, protected from the horizontal wind-driven snow by the bark of an arch, and from the vertically falling snow by the arch's continuous cover, was at the end of the 5.5-day norther, exactly as it had been at the beginning. The wood pieces dry, no surface snow, no ice bonding between adjacent pieces. She could reach in under the arch's lower edge and pull pieces from the stack without the mallet or the pry bar. The arch had done what the flat shed roof could not do. It had shed the norther's snow rather than holding it. She noted in the household journal, January 14th, 1873, norther ended. Woodpile under the arch is clean, no ice bonding, no surface snow. Open shed pile is packed and bonded as usual. The arch shed the snow throughout the event. The arch knows how to shed snow. The flat roof does not. The arch knows how to shed snow. The flat roof does not. This was the key phrase, and it stated the structural principle as precisely as any in the series. The arch's geometry was the reason for the success. and the flat roof's geometry was the reason for the open shed's failure. The arch was not warmer, more insulated, or more massive than the flat shed roof. It was differently shaped. The shape was the mechanism. The curved surface shed the snow that the flat surface held. The Barton County Historical Society in Great Bend, Kansas, which absorbed several Rice County pioneer records before the Rice County Historical Society was established in later years, has the Hannah Morse Household Journal, one volume from 1872 through 1879, donated by her granddaughter Ruth Morse Caldwell in 1931. The January 8th construction entries are in the volume. The January 14th Northern Outcome entry and the key phrase are in the volume. The record is in Great Bend. It is still there. The structural physics of the bent pole arch, which made it superior to the flat shed roof for snow shedding in the Kansas blue northern conditions, can be stated with precision because the principle is the same one that governs every arch structure from Roman bridge vaults to the snow barrel vaults of the fur traders' winter camps. An arch transfers its load to its supports through compression. Any load applied to the arch's surface, snow, wind pressure, its own weight is converted by the arch's geometry into a compressive force that travels down the arch's curve to the foundation points at the arch's base. The arch does not resist the load in bending. It transfers the load in compression. Compression is the structural mode that the arch's material, in this case, green willow, can handle efficiently. The willow's tensile strength in the bent configuration is the limiting factor, and the lashing at the stakes maintains the tension that holds the arch's curve against the spring force of the bent wood. For snow shedding, the arch's curved geometry is the operative feature. Snow that falls on a curved surface does not rest as securely as snow that falls on a flat surface. The flat surface provides zero slope angle, so the snow rests in stable equilibrium. The curved surface provides a continuously increasing slope angle from the arch's crown to its edges, and the snow on the curved surface is continuously subject to a gravitational component that drives it toward the lower edge. If the slope angle exceeds the snow's friction angle, which for wind-packed snow on a bark surface is approximately 25 to 30 degrees, the snow slides off rather than accumulating. At the Morse arch's construction geometry, approximately 3 feet of rise over an 8-foot span, the slope angle at the arch's midpoint was approximately 37 degrees. The slope angle at 3/4 of the arch from the crown was approximately 52 degrees. Both angles exceeded the wind-packed snow's 25 to 30 degree friction threshold, so the wind-driven snow that struck the arch's surface above the midpoint slid down the curve and off the lower edge rather than accumulating. Only the section nearest the crown where the slope angle was below 30 degrees accumulated any snow, and the norther's wind pressure assisted the shedding of even that small accumulation. She had not known the friction angle or the slope calculations. She had known the observation from the creek bottom. The willow domes that the Kansas River Country tribes used for their temporary winter camps shed snow because of their rounded shape, while the flat-roofed settler sheds held snow because of their flat shape. She had seen this observation expressed in the Big Creek Country's natural forms. Snow slid off the rounded tops of the creek bank willow thickets and piled at their bases. Snow accumulated on the flat frozen surface of the creek ice. The round sheds, the flat holds. The arch knows how to shed snow. The flat roof does not. The arch principle she was applying was not a European building tradition. It was a Plains Indian construction principle that she had observed in the Big Creek Country, combined with the green willow that the Big Creek bottomland produced in abundance. The combination of the observed principle and the available material produced the construction in one day. The specific properties of the green willow that made it the correct pole material for the bent pole arch, and that distinguished it from dry cottonwood or seasoned lumber that would have been available on the farm, are worth establishing because the material choice was as important as the construction form. Green willow and its second-year growth, the flexible whip-like growth that the Big Creek bottomland produced in dense stands from the creeping root system of the plains. Willow had a specific combination of properties that made it ideal for the bent arch application. The wood's moisture content in January, when the sap was down but not fully dormant, was approximately 40 to 50%, very high by the standards of cured firewood, but exactly the condition needed for the bending application. High moisture content in wood increases the wood's flexibility by reducing the brittleness of the lignin matrix that holds the cellulose fibers together. A moist green wood bends without cracking at angles that would shatter a dry wood. The second-year willow growth had a diameter of approximately 1 inch, large enough to be structurally meaningful as an arch member, but small enough to be bent into a 3-foot rise arch over an 8-foot span without exceeding the wood's bending capacity. A larger diameter pole, 3 inches, say would have too high a resistance to bending and would require much greater force to hold in the arch configuration. The stake lashing would not have been adequate. A smaller pole, half an inch, would have had insufficient structural stiffness to resist the wind load of a Kansas Blue Norther at 38 miles per hour. The arch would have deflected under the wind pressure and lost its geometry. 1 inch diameter was the practical optimum for the available lashing force and the required structural stiffness, and the Big Creek bottomland produced 1 inch diameter, second-year willow in exactly the length she needed, 6 to 7 feet, without requiring any special selection or cutting. The raw material was matched to the construction requirement by the accident of the Big Creek's specific growth conditions. She had noted the material selection in the January 8 journal entry. January 8, 1873, Ezra cut the second-year willow from the Big Creek lower stand, the 1 inch diameter whips, 6 to 7 feet long. These are the right size for the arch, small enough to bend over an 8-foot span, large enough to hold shape under the wind. He brought 40 poles. I need 30. She had the material selection criterion explicitly in the journal: small enough to bend, large enough to hold shape. She had identified the trade-off accurately and had confirmed the Big Creek willow met the criterion before construction began. The construction account in the journal, which documented January 8's work from Ezra's departure for Big Creek in the morning through the completion of the bark covering in the evening, provides the most detailed single-day construction record of any account in the series. January 8 morning. Ezra rides to Big Creek. Estimate 2 hours round trip with the pole load. January 8 mid-morning. Stakes driven at the woodpile. The January frost has set the ground hard to 8 or 10 inches. The fence maul is required for each stake. 6 pairs, 8 feet apart at each pair. 3 feet between pairs front to back. 20 minutes per stake pair. 2 hours for all 6 pairs. January 8, noon. Ezra returns with the poles. First arch, 1 pole forced into the curve between the east stake pair at the pile's south end, lashed with the braided grass cord at each end. The first arch is the hardest. The pole resists the bending at first, then suddenly yields into the curve as the inner fibers compress and the outer fibers stretch to the new configuration. Subsequent arch is easier because the technique is established. January 8 afternoon. 6 arches complete. For longitudinal willow rods woven through the arch tops to stabilize the structure against lateral movement. Then the bark covering, cottonwood bark from the barn pile, lapped over the arch from the bottom upward. The bark's natural curvature settles against the arch naturally. Willow branch fill between bark courses. January 8 evening. Covering complete. She walks round the arch and presses on it at the midpoint. Solid. No give. She shakes it. It moves slightly in the overall frame, but does not deform. She pushes on the south face with both hands. No movement. The arch is sound. She writes, arch complete, 8 hours, 2 people. Ready for the norther. The 8 hours, 2 people. 40 willow poles cut from Big Creek. 24 cottonwood bark slabs from the barn pile. Braided grass cord for the lashings. The fence maul for the stakes. The total material cost from purchased supplies, 0. All materials were from the farm or the adjacent creek bottom. The labor was January 8th. The norther arrived January 9th. The comparison between the bent pole arch method and the other woodpile protection methods documented in the series reveals the specific innovation of using structural geometry rather than thermal mass or moisture protection as the primary mechanism. All the other woodpile protection accounts in the series had used one of 3 approaches: thermal mass, placing the wood in a cave or underground space where the earth's constant temperature prevented freeze-thaw cycling; moisture protection, placing the wood below grade or in a ventilated space where rain, driven snow, and condensation could not reach; or access security, placing the wood in a hidden space where it could not be seen or reached from outside. Each of these approaches addressed the woodpile protection problem by controlling the environment around the wood. The bent pole arch addressed the problem differently. It controlled the structural response to the snow loading rather than the snow's access to the wood. The arch did not prevent snow from reaching the woodpile's vicinity. It ensured that the snow that reached the arch's surface was shed rather than accumulated. The snow fell on the arch and slid off. The arch was not a barrier, it was a deflector. The difference between a barrier and a deflector was the arch's curved geometry. This was a uniquely mechanical solution in the series, not thermal management, not moisture management, not security, but structural geometry as the primary mechanism. The arch's curve was doing the work. The flat shed roof's flatness was what had been failing. The curve was the innovation. The willow and bark were merely the materials that expressed the curve. She had stated this precisely in the key phrase. The arch knows how to shed snow. The flat roof does not. The arch and the flat roof knew different things because they had different shapes. The shapes were the knowledge. The willow was just willow. The curve was the knowledge. The transmission of the bent pole arch method in the Rice County and adjoining Kansas Prairie community is documented in the journal's spring 1873 entries. When the winter's results became visible and the community's farm visits resumed, the spring gathering of the Big Creek Settlement Church community in April of 1873 was the first social event after the winter's isolation, and it was at this gathering that Hannah described the bent pole arch to the assembled families. She had brought one of the arch's willow poles, still holding its curve from the winter's lashing, and had demonstrated the construction by bending a fresh willow switch into the arch form and explaining the stake positions and the bark covering. She noted the spring gathering in the April journal entry, April 1873. Church gathering at Metzger's, described the bent pole arch to the women's group, showed the willow pole still holding its curve. 3 families asked the full construction details, stake spacing, pole length, bark lapping, told them, 2 people one day, second-year willow from the creek, cottonwood bark from the split sections. The arch sheds the northern snow, the flat shed holds it. For other families, said they would build arches over their wood piles before the next winter. 5 families had ice piles this winter. The arch solved the problem at zero material cost. Zero material cost. This was the economic summary that she had provided to the church gathering, the same framing that Lars Björnsson had used for the hill and Eleanor Baxter had used for the hill. The material was already there. It had always been there. The innovation was the use of the available material in a form that the available material's properties supported. The willow was already at Big Creek. The bark was already on the cottonwood. The construction was the knowledge of which form to use. The Barton County Historical Society in Great Bend, Kansas, 1 volume, 1872 through 1879, donated 1931 by Ruth Morse Caldwell. The January 8th construction entries. The January 14th Northern outcome entry. The key phrase, the arch knows how to shed snow, the flat roof does not. The April 1873 church gathering transmission. The record is in Great Bend. The willow is still at Big Creek. The arch principle is still the same. The record is still there. The 7 winters of the Hannah Moore's Household Journal, from the January 1873 first construction through the final entries of 1879, document the bent pole arch's annual construction and performance across the range of Rice County winter conditions. The arch was rebuilt each autumn before the northern season. The previous winter's arch, dried by the summer heat, had lost the green willow's flexibility and was no longer structurally reliable. Each October, Ezra cut fresh second-year willow from Big Creek and rebuilt the arch over the replenished woodpile. The reconstruction became a standard autumn preparation entry in the journal from 1873 onward. October 1873. Ezra cut fresh willow, arch rebuilt over the new pile, ready for the northern season. And in October 1874, willow, arch rebuilt. For hours this year, faster with the established stake holes from last year. By October 1876, the entry was 2 words, arch rebuilt. The annual reconstruction was not a disadvantage. It was a scheduled maintenance procedure that took 4 hours in a good October morning and cost nothing in materials. The stakes were already in the ground from the previous year. The cottonwood bark pile grew each summer when Jonas had split the firewood sections. The second-year willow regrew every year from the Big Creek root system, producing a new crop of the 67-foot flexible poles each season. The material was renewable. The construction was annual. The cost was zero. The performance across 7 winters, the winter of 1873 to 74, was milder than 1872 to 73, with the worst northern event at -8 for 3 days. The the arch shed the snow as expected. The Norther's ice bonding problem was less severe in the milder winter, but the arch's protection was still visible in the comparison between the covered woodpile and the open sheds remaining. Uncovered section, the few pieces that overflowed the arch's coverage area still bonded, while the covered pieces remained separable. The winter of 1875–76 was severe, comparable to 1872–73, and provided the second full winter confirmation of the arch's performance. The worst event was the December 27th through January 2nd norther at -15 for 6 days. The arch shed the driven snow throughout. The woodpile under the arch was dry and unbonded at the event's end. The open shed's remaining pieces were bonded and required the mallet. She wrote, December 1875, norther ended, arch pile clean, no bonding, open shed bonded as usual. The arch is the reason. She had been writing this observation since 1873. By 1877 she was noting the arch's performance only when a norther was severe enough to be worth noting. The mild norther events, -6 for 2 days, produced so little ice bonding problem, even on the open shed, wood that the arch's advantage was minimal. The severe norther events, -15 for 5 or more days, continued to show the arch's advantage clearly. The arch was most useful precisely in the conditions that were most difficult to manage by other means. The construction mechanics of the stake driving in frozen January ground, which the journal documented as requiring the fence maul at 20 minutes per stake pair, produced a specific problem in the first construction that Hannah and Ezra had solved through improvisation. The problem: the January Kansas soil was frozen to approximately 8 to 10 inches of depth by the time the January 8th construction began. The cottonwood stakes needed to be driven to 14 inches through the frozen layer and into the unfrozen clay below for secure anchorage. The fence maul's repeated blows at the stake top drove the stake through the frozen surface, but risked splitting the stake at the point where the frozen and unfrozen soil boundary created a differential resistance. The stake drove easily through the unfrozen clay below, and suddenly encountered strong resistance at the frozen and frozen boundary when driven back up under frost heave pressure. She had solved the problem by preheating each stake in the sod house for an hour before driving. The warm wood of the heated stake had slightly more resilience against splitting than the cold, brittle, winter-dry cottonwood would have had. This was not a calculation, it was the observation that warm wood had more give than cold wood, and that the stakes that had been warming by the sod house stove for an hour drove more cleanly than the cold stakes from the barn pile. She noted, January 8th, warm the stakes before driving the warm wood is less likely to split at the frost layer boundary. This works. The warm wood drives more cleanly. This secondary observation included in the January 8th entry alongside the arch. Construction documentation was the kind of practical engineering insight that the series' journal accounts consistently produced. The observation of a physical phenomenon, warm wood, is more resilient than cold wood. Stated without the theoretical explanation, wood cell wall structure is more flexible. Above its glass transition temperature, applied correctly to the specific construction challenge stake. Driving in frozen and unfrozen differential ground. Every account in the series had produced one or more such secondary observations that were as practically useful as the primary mechanisms, but that arose from the specific construction conditions rather than the pre-planned design. Thomas had warmed the stakes. Ingrid Burenson had noted the floor was warmer by the pipe. Borghild Hodge had noted the floor temperature improved. The construction produced the unexpected benefit. The journal recorded it. The Hannah Moore's account occupies a specific position in the series. Larger pattern, because it is the only mechanism in the series that used structural geometry, the arch form, as the primary protective principle, rather than thermal mass, moisture exclusion, ventilation, or earth contact. All the other firewood protection accounts had addressed the wood's environment, putting the wood in a space that was thermally stable, moisture-controlled, or hidden from hazard. The bent pole arch addressed the snow's behavior on impact with the covering structure. The arch's curved geometry caused the snow to shed, rather than accumulate. The arch did not change the wood's environment. It changed what happened to the snow before it could reach the wood. This distinction makes the Morse arch the only mechanism in the firewood protection accounts that would have provided no benefit in a calm, still cold event. On a calm non-norther January day, snow falling vertically on the arch's surface would accumulate as it would on any surface. because the gravitational component along the curve would be small enough that the snow's friction would hold it. The arch's benefit was specific to the horizontal driven snow of the Kansas Blue Norther, the condition where the wind pressure added to the gravitational component and exceeded the snow's friction threshold on the curved surface, removed the wind, and the arch was a shelter. With the wind, it was a deflector. She had understood this specificity. In the April 1873 church gathering account, she had stated it directly. The arch is for the norther. In a still snowstorm, the arch does not help much. In a norther, the arch is the only thing that keeps the pile clean. She had identified the specific condition for which the arch was the correct solution and the specific condition for which it was not necessary. The norther was the condition. The arch was the solution for that condition specifically. The Kansas Blue Norther's specific combination of extreme cold, high wind speed, and horizontal snow drive had produced the ice bonding problem that made the woodpile inaccessible after each event. The arch's curved geometry was the specific structural response to that specific weather phenomenon, the right solution for the right condition. The Big Creek willow was the right material for the right structure. Everything was specific. The generalization was the curve. The arch knows how to shed snow. The flat roof does not. The Barton County Historical Society in Great Bend, Kansas. 1 volume 1872 through 1879. Donated 1931 by Ruth Morse Caldwell. The January 8, 1873 construction entries. The material selection. The stake driving. The warm stake discovery. The arch raising. The bark covering. And the completion at 8 hours. The January 14, 1873 norther outcome. Clean woodpile. No bonding, the key phrase. The April 1873 church gathering transmission. 7 winters of annual October rebuilding entries. The arch knows how to shed snow. The flat roof does not. The willow is at Big Creek. The curve is still the principle. The record is in Great Bend. It is still there. The specific observation from the Big Creek country's tribal winter camps, which had given Hannah the arch principle, represents one of the series clearest examples of the knowledge transfer from the indigenous practice of the American frontier to the settler farming community. The Plains tribes of the Kansas country, the Kansas Osage, and the various bands of the Wichita Confederacy, who had used the Big Creek country as hunting and camping territory, had been building domed and arched temporary structures for centuries before the settler. Homesteading began in the 1860s. The bent pole dome construction of the Great Plains tribes. Temporary winter camps used the same green willow or ash saplings that Hannah had used, bent and lashed into a hemispherical or barrel vault form, and covered with hides, bark, or woven grass. The dome and arch forms had been used precisely because they shed snow and wind-driven precipitation in the Kansas winter conditions, the same principle that Hannah had applied to the woodpile coverage problem. She had observed these structures during the first years of the Big Creek settlement, when the tribal use of the creek bottom overlapped with the settler presence in the transitional period of the early 1870s. The observation had been stored as a practical engineering fact. The rounded structures shed snow. She had not needed to theorize the principle. She had seen the result directly. When the January 8th woodpile protection problem had required a solution, the stored observation of the tribal dome structures had been the reference that produced the arch construction. She had not noted this origin in the journal. The journal was a practical farm account, not an ethnographic record, and the source of an idea was less relevant to the journal's purpose than the construction method and the result. But the connection was visible in the context. Big Creek in 1873 was the transitional landscape where the tribal winter camp knowledge and the settler engineering knowledge were both present, and the bent pole arch over the Morse woodpile was the specific application of the tribal structural principle to the settler's specific woodpile problem. The willow was Big Creek's willow. The arch principle was the Creek country's teaching. The bark was the cottonwood bark that Jonas had split. The lashing was the braided grass cord from the claim's own materials. Everything was from the Big Creek country. The construction was what the Big Creek country had been teaching anyone who had been watching. Hannah had been watching. The arch knows how to shed snow. The Big Creek country knew this before the settlers arrived. The journal records that Hannah learned it there. The Barton County Historical Society in Great Bend, Kansas. 1 volume 1872 through 1879. The January 8th construction in 1 day. The January 14th outcome. Clean woodpile. No bonding. The key phrase, the arch knows how to shed snow, the flat roof does not. The annual October rebuilding, 7 winters confirmed. The record is in Great Bend. The willow is still at Big Creek. The arch principle is still the same. The record is still there. The arch knows how to shed snow. It always did.